Pan Am really could not have begun operating without extensive kind of government assistance in the form of postal subsidies, in the form of diplomatic assistance, because at the time when Pan Am began operating, I'm talking now late 20s, early 30s, planes of this time were very small and they could not survive on ticket sales alone. And this was true of domestic airlines as well. So postal subsidies played a really big role in enabling the formation of the airline industry. And that in part explains why it was regulated. But it was not a kind of continuous story of regulation from the beginning. And really what we think of as, now being kind of, standard regulations for safety and things like that were implemented in the mid-30s, actually, under the Roosevelt administration after a number of, really kind of disastrous incidents of, airplanes crashing and, airlines kind of not being able to, kind of operate on their own. In a sense, Pan Am kind of operated as a de facto national carrier until 1945. It was the United States' exclusive international airline. It had a monopoly on international routes. Again, it received, extensive state support in the form of both postal subsidies and diplomatic assistance. But frankly, even, the kind of discussions both in the kind of public sphere and within the aviation industry about, should the United States have a national carrier like these other countries? I mean, there was not consensus on this, and there was a lot of antipathy. I think that, really kind of dates back to, Americans kind of love of free enterprise and, and real kind of skepticism about to what extent should the government be involved, in industry and in business. And of course, the airline industry was maturing basically in the context of the New Deal, when these discussions were also, happening in, relation to, the kinds of, reforms that Roosevelt had implemented, that were kind of changing corporate government relationships. So there was a sense that the government should be involved in regulating the industry in order to make it safe, in order to make it profitable for the long term. But we shouldn't go so far, as to make it actually a government-owned airline, that we should still reserve room for private ownership. Pan Am absolutely was seen both within the United States and all over the world as a symbol of the United States. And in its own advertising and marketing, it used kind of explicitly nationalist iconography and rhetoric in order to market itself as basically an ambassador of the United States, and indeed, in some cases, almost as a kind of substitute for the US government. Because especially in Pan Am's early years in the 1920s and 30s, sometimes it would have sales offices in these kind of far-flung locations where the US Embassy didn't necessarily have a presence. So Pan Am's station agents on the ground were often the Americans in the region who kind of had, and this goes back to kind of a long, tradition of kind of, businessmen serving as, as kind of unofficial ambassadors. Pan Am's kind of presence in these countries really did serve to kind of represent the United States. But it gets complicated, though, and this is the argument that I try to make in the book, that on the one hand, Pan Am had these kind of profound nationalist significations, but on the other hand, it also very much branded itself as a global citizen. So there's a kind of tension between its nationalism and its globalism. And I argue that ultimately, nationalism and globalism were entirely compatible, that we're inclined to think about those terms as being somehow antithetical, but Pan Am justified its right and indeed its responsibility to kind of become the major airline in the entire world, by appealing to kind of traditional American nationalist notions of manifest destiny and national greatness. And obviously the fact that aviation had been invented in the United States played a large role in this. It was, aviation itself had a lot of nationalist connotations. President Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act in 1978, and it dismantled this kind of long-standing system of regulations, not necessarily on safety, because we still have those today, but it dismantled the economic regulations. And so it enabled a number of newer kind of low-cost airlines, such as Delta, to enter the market kind of on their own terms. And a lot of these newer airlines were operating with non-unionized labor. cheaper. So they had cheaper operating costs. Most of them were domestic. So they weren't dealing with like the kind of the so-called legacy airlines of the late 70s, like airlines like Pan Am and TWA had these international routes all over the world that weren't necessarily profitable. They were routes to places like, like Baghdad, for instance, or Leopoldville in the Congo. And, they had been established, in the Cold War as a way of kind of ensuring that, the United States had access, to everywhere in the world, but they weren't, sustainable. So really 1978, I think, kind of radically changed the structure of the aviation industry in terms of kind of decoupling it from government on the one hand, but then also changing kind of, the ways in which the industry itself was structured, and it, obviously opened it up to more competition from these newer carriers. The commercial air travel industry has always had a difficult time being profitable. And when Pan Am was financially successful, it was in the context of these kind of regulatory structures and subsidies that existed in its earlier decades. So certainly deregulation was a factor in its demise. Also this kind of crisis of leadership after Juan Tripp's retirement. It possibly could have survived with any one of these challenges, but it was to an extent a kind of perfect storm of both internal and external crises. And then the final thing that happened was the bombing of Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. And this was at a time when Pan Am was already struggling financially, but this just caused a kind of a huge crisis of public confidence, and it greatly contributed to a decline of employee morale. And one pilot in his memoir says that Lockerbie was the day that the heart of Pan Am died.